Hi, and welcome to this episode of John's Motorcycle Rescue and Review. Today I am with Yamaha's 1982 Maxim 1100. It's also called an XJ1100J. And this is kind of my first full day of ownership here. And I have been busy. A really nice thing that I was able to do before purchasing this bike is I was able to ride the bike up the road and shift it and drive it and see how it rode and drove. And that's just priceless when you're looking at a vintage machine, because if you buy a non-runner, there's just no way of telling all the different things that you can possibly run into as you get the bike going. And so this bike has been run and maintained fairly regularly. The gas tank is super clean inside, which I'm very happy about. That's another thing if you're thinking about buying vintage. And check the gas tank out, make sure it is clean, otherwise they can just be a real pain. A couple of items that came with the purchase that I'm very happy to have. The first one is an actual Yamaha XJ1100J service manual. And that's gold. That will really help out as I'm going through the machine. This is my first big Yamaha, so it's always nice to have, you know, the official source for how to do things. What I've done so far is I have gone in and changed the fluid in the shaft drive here. One thing that I've noticed is different than the other bikes that I've done is that Yamaha actually uses one-time crush washers for the crush washers here, but they use the same crush washer for the top, the bottom. They also use the same crush washer for the top and bottom of your the gear oil reservoir here, and they use the same crush washer for the engine oil. So if you're doing a Yamaha XS1100, if you're working on one, or an XJ1100, I would suggest having a bunch of those crush washers in hand, just because to do the services that I did, which was an oil and filter change. I did the gear oil in the mid case here, and also the gear oil in the rear, and it takes a total of 5 of those crush washers. So I used the 8090 Lucas gear oil when I did that. So that's done. I use the stock oil filter for the Yamaha here, and I use 20W50 Yamaha lube when I did the oil change. I'm going to be riding this in mostly warmer weather, so that should be fine for over the summer months. Alright, as I'm starting to work on this, I'm noticing some interesting features. And the first thing is, this actually has a computer, and it cycles through every time you turn the bike on. It's got a gas gauge here, but it cycles through and tells you, this warning light will illuminate if there's an issue with any of the systems that it checks. And it was giving me a battery warning light, and that is because the original sensor actually went down into the battery and looked for 12 volts of voltage, and it would tell you if it was making less than 12 volts of voltage. And so what I did was simply hook that lead up that used to go down into the battery. I hooked that lead up to a positive, and so now it sees the 12 volts. The nice thing is it'll warn me if I'm down below 12 volts while it's running, which is great. So it still functions like it should, and it's still useful, but now at least my battery warning light isn't on. Also, I went in and changed the brake fluid in all of the reservoirs, and one of the things that I noticed is another interesting feature of this Yamaha. If you trace this brake line down, normally you have a junction right about here. Now there's a junction, but if you notice, these two lines aren't connected. So the front brake lever only operates this right side front caliper. The left side front caliper is actually activated by the rear brake, and so it's got a bigger reservoir in the back, and the fluid actually goes to the rear brake and to the front brake when you hit the foot brake on this bike. Very interesting feature, and it's helpful to know that out on the road. You know, that way I know to always use my rear brake in conjunction with my, you know, my front brake lever. As I was at the back of the bike and looking at and changing the fluid in the rear brake reservoir here, now that I had to bleed it out in the back here, as I said before, that's standard, right? But I also had to use the rear brake pedal to bleed out the left front brake caliper. So that's all fed off of this reservoir. So it's all new fluid in there. The brake lines are bled. There's no air in the lines anymore. Another unique feature, again, this is my first Yamaha that I'm working on, and a very interesting feature is, so this brake caliper, instead of moving in and out, it actually rotates around this shaft as you put the brakes on. And the problem I have with that is, so it looks like I've got meat on my brake pads here, but if you pull these brake pads out, they're not worn evenly, and so they've got spots on them where I've got 3 or 4 30-seconds, and then spots where I have less than 1. So these brake pads, even though they look good if I was just doing a visual here, they are bad. So I've ordered new brake pads here. So it's an interesting design. I think they went to a different design just because of the way it wears funny on the pads. While I was in there checking everything, I checked to make sure that when I apply the brakes, I then have free motion of my wheel. So I pulled the caliper off. I pushed the piston out with the brake pedal so it was pretty far out. Checked to make sure it was clean, and then I also used some WD-40 and a toothbrush and cleaned the piston really well, and then replaced everything and just made sure all of my motion is free, and that's great. I'm waiting currently to finish up this rear brake. I'm just waiting on brake pads, but everything else looked good right here. I'm going to move a little bit forward here. Another thing I noticed when I was working on the brakes, I noticed that the shock on the right side of the bike had leaked oil all over here. So the air shock was blown, and you can't really get them anymore. So fortunately, I had on a parts bike, I had basically a brand new set of progressive springs and shocks, and so I just grabbed the progressive. These are conventional units, they have preload only, but you know, I may lose a little bit of ride softness with these, but at least they're not blown, and the stockers just needed to be replaced. So it now has brand new rear shocks on it. I rode the bike, the first day I had it, I rode the bike about 20 miles. I aired up the tires, made sure all my fluids were at the correct levels, and then I rode it. And it rode decent, the suspension was very soft, and what I noticed was there's fork oil just pouring out of these forks, and that is actually what is all over the front wheel. It's fork oil. And so it has contaminated my brake pads, and so even though the thicknesses are okay, the brake pads themselves need to be replaced. So I've got new ones on order. I will, when I put them in, I'm going to pull these calipers off, clean everything up really well, and again, I'm going to push the piston out on them, and I'm going to make sure that the surface is free of pits, free of dirt and debris, and then I'm going to reinstall everything with the new brake pads. Of course, that's after I clean up these wheels, because they've got fork oil even in these grooves here. It's just gross. The wheel's coated with it. So I need to pressure wash those off and get everything really, really clean before I install the new brake pads. I'm also going to be replacing these dust seals and the fork seals on this front suspension. But I think doing that, it's really going to make the bike a lot more actually drivable and usable, and I'm actually going to have front brakes, because right now these are so contaminated that I have hardly any brakes on the bike. It barely stops, and it's just absolutely not safe to drive. So until I finish this whole system up, I'm not going to be driving the bike more. Another thing I did, this bike has a cam chain tensioner here. but it's not an automatic one. And so I had to, there's a procedure in the shop manual that shows you how to set the crank at the correct position, and then you just go in here, and I'm trying to move this out of the way. There's a lock nut right there, and there's 12mm lock nut and a 10mm bolt. What you do is set the crank at the right position, and then you loosen the lock nut and then loosen the 10mm bolt. You don't want to take it out, just loosen it. And I even tapped on the housing on the outside a little bit with a wrench, just to, you know, what happens is when you loosen that, the spring tension that is behind the tensioner should reset the cam chain tension to the proper tension, and then you just lock everything back down. So you tighten down your 10mm and then you tighten your lock nut, your 12mm. And when I restore these bikes and kind of recondition them, getting them ready to go back on the road and to ride and drive safely again, you know, there's a lot of stuff to go through. It's not quick and easy, but you know, you just want to go through your systems one by one and make sure that the bike is actually safe to ride. I may replace the tires on this bike. They have some life left in them yet, but you know, I always feel safer with new tires. Like I say, these aren't hateful by any stretch. Just a couple more things that I did. Under this cover, you have a clutch adjustment at the disengagement adjustment here at the motor, and I adjusted that. And there's a procedure for that in the manual. I also adjusted this so there's just a little bit of free play here before the clutch engages. You don't want much, and then it starts to pull. So that's set like it should be. Throttle tension is maybe a little bit almost on the tight side. I'll have to maybe adjust it a little bit looser. And then finally, I pulled this cover here. You have to pull the seat, then pull this cover, and there's two bolts. Pull this out, and then you can inspect the air filter. The air filter itself was in like new condition. And when I rode the bike, I was, you know, just trying to feel if it seemed lean or anything. It does have these visual cracks on the outside of the car boots. I may yet go ahead and replace those, but it doesn't feel like, the way that it rides and drives, it doesn't feel like it's actually sucking air in. So I don't know if there's a product. I'm gonna have to do a little bit of research, you know, maybe put some on the outside here, or just I may just go ahead and replace these boots. But everything else actually seems pretty decent on it. Like I say, it rides, drives, shifts. The engine pulls like it should. But I'm just going to keep going through it. I'm going to be checking my exhaust bolts and, you know, starting to clean things up cosmetically. And this bike will clean up nice. There's just a lot of little things, you know, there's a lot of wax overage on it. It definitely needs a good pressure wash. But it will clean up nice, and it's just it is a nice riding bike. When I took it out for a ride, I was just really surprised at how pleasant it is, how comfortable it is. And once it has decent brakes, it'll be a lot more safe to ride and a lot more enjoyable, because I don't have to be afraid while I'm riding it. I hope you found this video entertaining and informative, and until next time, enjoy the ride.